Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and doctors, uh, we're going to be changing up next week. You should see some very exciting changes in the opening of these podcasts. We're also going to be breaking out a little bit differently the location demographic stuff from the marketing things. And I'm kind of excited about it, as a matter of fact. So, Mike, one quick thing I wanted to put on our schedule for the marketing things and to kind of tease this. I want to talk about the GRPs of professional practices, the buildings. And I know most people don't know what a GRP is. It stands for gross rating point. But as you may or may not know, the benefit of going to a particular office often is the visibility of that office to the people passing by. And it will involve traffic counts and the demography of people who are passing by your office. This is such an advanced bit of research that most people have no idea that it even exists. And we figured, doctors, you ought to know, because everybody else in the marketing world knows how important this is, and certainly you ought to, because or the price of your building is often being influenced by the GRPs. And we want to talk about leakage factor, and it's not that kind of leakage.
I was gonna say.
Well, you get to a certain age.
That's what I was gonna make an age joke, and you well.
Thank you. I wanted to preempt that, Mike. Thank you. That's just embarrassing. Now, I'm going to jump into this as part of our series on the metropolitan areas, the MSAs, municipal statistical areas. Today, we're going to be talking about Chicagoland. Last week, we talked about New York City, and the week before that, we did Seattle. Mike is arranging on our website the archives so that you can look up particular areas more easily and use this as a reference. Now, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. Our goal in doing these webinars is to create information free of charge to doctors. We don't want to tease this.
We're not charging for this stuff?
Not anymore.
Right.
And the reason that we're doing that is because we believe that informed clients are by far the best. So the more we can tell you about something and have you say, gee, tell me about this specific area, builds our credibility, but it also helps you. And that's kind of what we're after. Right, Mike?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you for nodding. All right. Now, Mike is in southern Utah, where it's colder than northern Utah right now.
It is cold.
I'm sorry. Those little ponies and goats are probably just...
They're freezing. They're freezing.
Yeah, but God bless them with fur coats, and so, it's our way of getting back. Now, we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to use our time primarily on Chicagoland. Is fair enough?
Yeah.
Now, something I want our viewers and listeners to recognize. When we're talking about Chicagoland, it's not Chicago. It's Greater Chicago, and they have a euphemism that they use, which is Chicagoland, which is the entire region. And it is a fairly large region, and it is not limited just to the city of Chicago. The other thing you ought to know is this is not a practice that's that unusual. Do you know that Hollywood sign, Mike? You've seen that?
Yeah.
It's actually only part of the sign, right? It used to
it was used to be Hollywood Land, right? Yeah.
That's right. And this is a practice that goes back quite a long way. Now, I'm going to jump over and start showing my PowerPoint presentation. And of course, we always hope that it will work because technology frightens us, We are the caveman demographers. All right, let's put this into slideshow mode. Does anybody get that Phil Hartman reference from Saturday Night Live? Probably not. You kids.
I know, I do. I was a big fan of Phil Hartman and his caveman bit.
What a terrible, sad passing. But
it is horrible.
I'm not bitter. All right, now let's get into this thing, practicing in Chicagoland. Now, I bring this thing about the MSAs, or municipal statistical areas, because it is unwise to assume that any MSA is like another MSA. You don't just say, oh, it's a big city, therefore it's the same. There are some things they have in common, but a lot of things that make them unique. And we're going to talk a little bit about what makes this area a little bit unique. You may or may not know that Chicagoland was actually the start of the study of urban and suburban locations. All goes back to the city planners first started looking at how the city was organized here. That was, it happened because of the great fire that they had, destroyed everything but just, the water tower in downtown Chicago. And ultimately, they were able to scientifically plan how the streets were laid out and how they related to each other, a network of streets and transportation arteries. So the challenge here is you have to pick and choose where you look in Chicagoland. Couple of reasons. For one, the distance between rich and poor neighborhoods is actually less here than it is in many other places. The other thing is the way it's laid out is a little more logical than it is, say, in New York City, where you have this weird Broadway thing that kind of goes at a slant through the rest of the island of Manhattan, and the other streets are just odd. Chicagoland has more rationality for how the city was laid out. But the area is really changing. Now, the key to Chicagoland, understanding it, is churning. It means the turnover that is happening. And places that were used to be just fantastic right now are not so great. So if you're thinking about starting up or buying a practice, in Chicagoland, you've got to make sure that you're looking at the right choice, in other words. So it's a pick and choose situation. That's why people will go to a demographer and say, all right, I know that it was fantastic when Dr. Murphy, who's my grandfather's age, started the practice. Now, how does it look and where is it going? Now, ultimately, jobs are very, very important in this area. And ultimately, what we're looking at are things that are trying to predict, not just say where things are today. Places that are growing and show community development before data is available is why you need to know something about the predictions. You know that in 2020, we're having a brand new census, which really, by the way, won't be released until 2021. The reliability on these demographic counts are definitely useful. Ultimately, it is going to tell you everything. But it also is comparative. Now, one of the things that I mentioned about Chicagoland, the distance between where people work and where they live is kind of in flux. It used to be there was a suburban section that was definitely not a place of employment. Chicago's changed all that. Now, ultimately, don't worry about locating near employment centers. Look for new residences, if at all possible. Remember that there are reasons people like to commute. In short, they want to get away from the current neighborhood they're in. Life traffic in the suburbs are leading to sites to consider. And I really want you to understand, there are some really good things about Chicago that make it unusual. When there's growth, don't sweat the competition so much. Now, these are just general truisms of almost all metropolitan areas. Now, let's deconstruct Chicagoland for a second. If we look at this area where it has that little Burnside, Oakland, and Montclair, that's actually in the middle of Lake Michigan. Chicagoland is on the shore, and people talk about it being the Windy City. Well, that was actually a reference to the political debates that were going on, a lot of talking. But it is a windy place, and there's a thing called lake effect snow that we'll talk about a little later. If you were to look at each one of these parts of the city, each part is like a city or a mini metropolitan area unto itself. So you have to kind of keep in mind, when we talk about the south side and the north side, and then the far north, far south, north side, whatever, each of these is going to have a demographic characteristic that's different and unique. Now, if you were to come to us at Dr. Demographics and you were to say, look, I want to look at Westtown. Tell me about what's going on in Westtown, we could tell you. If you were to say, just tell me everything there is to know about Chicagoland, that is a tough thing to do. So the more you have an idea as to what type of people you want or a geographic region that you want to go to, the better we can help you. Now, I'm going to say this right off. I love Chicago. I really do. There's a lot about this place. The theater, the museums, the schools. I mean, it's just got a lot of things going on. I love that. I like that the American Dental Association, American Medical Associations are here. I like the schools that are here. To me, they're accessible and interesting. But Chicagoland is getting expensive, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, a couple of factors about understanding Chicagoland demographics. You know that there was a huge movement in the 1920s and 30s of blacks who were coming from the South, which was Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even parts of Texas, where they came. And where did they go? Did they go to New York City? Yes, some did. And that's how they settled Harlem. But Chicago had a huge demand for people who were working. And this created what they called the Black Belt, which is primarily on the south side of town. A large number of black belts, also black residents, also settled on the west side. Now, it was a highly localized thing when it came to race and ethnicity. That has changed a little. New York City and Chicago still retain a lot of the vestiges of their original ethnic distribution. I'm mentioning this because if you know who you want to reach, at least as far as race, ethnicity, language, or country of origin, it helps us very much, and Chicago's a great example. Here's something interesting. Chicago's been in decline for the better half of, going on close to 100 years. It went from 3.6 million in the 1950s down to 2.7 million people in 2010, and that is a lot. It overtook Los Angeles. It's used to be called the second city. Now, Los Angeles is the second largest city by itself. New York City is, of course, the largest. Why are people leaving? We're going to talk about that because you need to know if you're going to practice here what to look for and what to look out for and just to avoid. The city, they have said, demographers, that it's going to rise in 2020. It's going to increase. I don't agree with that. I actually think that Chicago, because of its structural difficulties, is going to decline unless it does what it says it's going to do in the last part of this episode. Now, there are definite Hispanic populations in this area, but for the reality, Hispanics are increasing. The African American population is decreasing. Now, just as a matter of interest, where are they going? Now, a lot of the black population is moving back. It's what they call a reverse migration. They're going back to Florida, to Mississippi. They're going back to, a lot of those places that they originally came from. And the reasons why are going to be important and instructive to you if you're thinking about practicing within this town. Chicago has a crime problem. Now, this probably doesn't overly surprise you. They've been talking about the crime problem for a long time. The crime is not localized. The crime actually happens in certain neighborhoods, it is true, but it happens almost all over Greater Chicago, with the exception of a few areas that we'll talk about. The murder rate has gone up a lot. Smaller American cities are kind of approaching that Chicago murder rate. New Orleans, Newark, and Detroit are really doing their best to catch up. But what we're really seeing is that violent crime and gang activity in Chicago is a thing that people are having to deal with. Now, the question is, what are they doing about it? I bring this up not to try to be a critic of Chicagoland, but rather the political things. Now, here's something I want you to understand about major metropolitan statistical areas. They almost never die of natural causes. They die of suicide. And suicide occurs when the people who are leading the city decide there's nothing we can do or nothing we should do to reduce the crime rate. New York City had a much higher crime rate, in fact, than Chicago. And when Mayor Giuliani came in, he kind of changed that around. But a population of politicians has entered the greater Chicagoland area in the city of Chicago and some of its surrounding areas. And what actually happened is the murder rate has increased. It's increased because they've said there's nothing we can do, and there's a huge problem between the police force and the elected officials. Now, you may be going, why are you telling me this? I just want to practice someplace. I'm saying this because the value of a practice site is very often not based upon how much it's growing or how much competition there is, but how much perceived crime there is. And the perception of crime is figured in two ways: crimes against people and crimes against property. Crimes against property is what people see most often. But crimes against people, and that's what the murder rate's all about, is considered more dangerous, because as an area becomes a murder capital, a place where people think, I don't want to go there, it's bad. Now, fortunately, the crime statistics in greater Chicago or Chicagoland are published by neighborhood. That's not true in most other major cities. They're done by county. But we actually can predict how bad are things getting and how bad are they going to be. Now, here's a couple of things about greater Chicago that I want you to be aware of. It's like a tube of toothpaste that you grab right in the middle and squeeze. It tends to, toothpaste comes out one end and kind of goes down out the other end. And that's happened to the middle class. Chicago has become, and this is generally true for the region, a place in which there's either very high income, which is what you see in the blue section in 2010, or very poor, which is what you see in the reddish section of 2010. Chicagoland used to be much more accommodating to a middle income population in the 70s. Now it has become a place of the very rich and the very poor, which you may think, well, that's great. There's some really rich neighborhoods, and there are. And you might notice that when you look at the competition ratios, the very rich, those dark blue places, are where everybody wants to go. And everybody is trying to avoid the other places. So if someone looks at a statistic and they're only going by what's the distribution of the number of doctors in practice of a particular type, you're going to say, oh, look, this particular part of Chicagoland, this is where I want to go. No, you don't. Because there are a lot of those kinds of places that are for sale. Now, there are also places in those blue sections that are a lot of places for sale. That's terrific, except those very high income places, they're charging an awful lot for those particular places. It's almost impossible to go into one of those bright blue neighborhoods and say, I want to do a startup. You can't. That's because there are just so many doctors who've been kind of squeezed into those corners. So what you're often looking for are places in the marginal red areas and the decreasing number of middle income places. Those are the places to go, even though the population increase is not that great. So you may be saying, well, what do I do if I want to practice here? I want to evaluate a site. I hate to say it, come to us, because we look at this stuff every day to try to determine, is this going to be a long-term benefit to where you want to practice or not? Now, people, why are they leaving Chicagoland, and specifically the city of Chicago? And it is true, they're leaving. Now, some people are estimating the population is about 10,000 people per year that are leaving. But that's a little deceptive, because they're not just leaving Chicagoland, they're leaving Chicago and going to outlying areas. In fact, Indiana has been the beneficiary of a lot of people leaving this part of Illinois. And there are lots of reasons why, but weather isn't one of them. It's going to be those other four categories that we'll talk about in a second. So when asked, why did you want to leave? Why are you getting out of here? The number one reason is the weather. It is cold. Haha. But for those who have actually lived in Chicago, it's hot. The range between hot summer and cold winter is very great. The summers can be ridiculously humid and it's tough. And that lake effect snow, it's kind of a challenge to your humanity. And I kind of think that's weather is one of those things, but no one can do anything about that. So let's look at the other things that are going on. The cost of living and the cost of doing business are a big deal. So with the cost of living and the cost of doing business, it all comes down to a few things. They don't allow new growth or new building within Chicagoland, and this is for almost the whole region. They're saying if you want to build here and you want to create something, you're going to have to tear another building down. And the building commissioner says, no, we have a great heritage in Chicagoland. Don't tear these buildings down. But what that has done is it's made a lot of things old and kind of nasty and more expensive. With this kind of rise in the cost of living and the cost of doing business, you have to choose very carefully the buildings that you will go to. Here's a general truism for practicing in Chicagoland. A lot of people are practicing in very small office buildings. They're choosing a footprint that's small. Therefore, they have to offload the business functions of their practice, like billing and appointments, to a place not in the operations center where they're doing clinical treatments. This is the natural consequence when the cost of living and the cost of doing business goes up. And Greater Chicago is a good model of what's going on. Now, the other thing I got to talk about is just a fact about raising taxes. Now, here's what happens. Let's just talk about the reality. When a lot of people leave an area, that creates a deficit in how much money that the city and the county can collect. Cook County, by the way, is the big county that is dominant in Chicagoland, but it's not the only county. So what they do is they say, we've got fewer taxpayers, and we therefore need to increase our revenues to be able to cover our bills. Now, we can't charge the poor because they have a very active political base, so we have to tax the rich. And therefore, the rich, who have the potential of being more mobile than almost any other group, up and leave. And that's a bad thing. So with so many people up and leaving, the taxes are going to continue to decline. And therefore, the politicians go, well, you know what we ought to do? We ought to increase the taxes. It is not the rich and it is not the poor who are paying the taxes. It's a shrinking middle class population. So when I mentioned that Indiana is picking up so many people, and even towns that don't have a great reputation, like Gary and South Bend, are picking up a lot of people because there's a lot of tax refugees. There's also a thing which I hate to say, but it's simply true. There's a death in family-friendly policies. Now, what do families care about? Well, middle-income people are often defined by a barbecue in the backyard. Now, having a single-family dwelling is what families tend to want. Jimmy and Betty can have their own room. They don't have to share, and it's kind of nice. So that's why single-family dwellings are great. But Chicagoland has had kind of a war on. It's considered a family-friendly policy disaster. Oh, and they've also figured we need to be much more accommodating in schools. So they're eliminating charter schools, which poor and middle-class families really like because it's like going to a private school. We're not allowing anybody in the school to be kicked out for bad behavior. And that is another family-friendly policy death. So the schools in Chicagoland are doing badly. Now, here's the solution to that. Most doctors, in their considering where to go, have to look for either a charter school or for a private school. There are some of the best private schools in the world in Greater Chicago. They're not overpriced as they are in many East Coast cities. So with a little bit more of a feeling with the parochial schools, for example, that are very friendly here, that tends to be a place to go. And it's the option that doctors will choose themselves. And also people who are more middle and upper middle class that they're seeking, you tend to identify an area based upon the school that you want to serve. And that's an indication of the demography. Now, there's a problem in violence. You probably already know about the murder rate. We kind of talked about it just a little bit. Is that going to go down? Well, I'm going to sound a little political here. When you have a political persuasion in a city government, and it is only one color, and I'm talking about, blue or red, you don't get the best results. Usually you have to have some kind of tension between conservatives and liberals to get the best mix. Unfortunately, right now that is not happening. It tends to make a self-fulfilling prophecy, not a good thing. Now, I know our time is running out, and I want to tell you, it's not as though all of Chicago is doing badly. It's not. If you want to go to a place like Bremen Heights Park or Downers Grove where the big money is, terrific. The problem is these are often the places that are full of other practices. But they are places that you can purchase a practice and make a significant amount of money. And I particularly like Downers Grove, to be quite honest. It's a nice place, low crime. It's good. Now, there's another place that we have to look at, and that is that southern area, Will County. Now, Will County actually has most of the really good growing areas, and they're going to be more suburban in their character. They're going to be on the, some people call it the edge, which is the development edge of the suburbs in western Chicago, but it's kind of southwestern Chicago. And that's where I kind of see stuff that's going on. Wilton Center, Joliet, by the way, which used to be kind of a pit, Lockport, Bolingbrook. Those are the places that if you really are thinking, where can I go and have an area that I'm going to serve middle and upper middle class populations, I'm not overcrowded too much by competition, Will County is the place that I kind of recommend you look. It isn't the only place to look, however. I want you to understand that. If you look at downtown Chicago, there is a huge number of businesses, lots of employees and high rises. That in itself is kind of an urban practice model. But to do that, it's a little bit scary if you want to commute out to the suburbs, which are on the primarily on the western side. The problem is the commute is getting longer and longer and longer. And getting from point A to point B is just, it's difficult. So the natural result is doctors are buying homes closer to where the new developments in the practice are. And that is going to be primarily on those interstates that skirt the western rim of the greater Chicagoland area. Now, some people say, well, what's going on there in Aurora and Canesville and Maple Park? Does that have potential? The answer is, yeah, it does. But because it's so far out, the people who are the upscale people that would normally commute into Chicago are considering it too far to go. So they're developing businesses and business centers that are in that western region of greater Chicago. And I think that's what's likely to continue happening. Now, I've already mentioned Hammond and Gary, Indiana, and all that. I believe that is going to be a continuing trend if it can be gentrified legally. There are some movements that say you can't do that. You can't kick out lower middle class and lower class people in order to develop their area. That's a court battle that we'll yet to see. But I want you to understand that at Dr. Demographics, we're looking at these areas all the time, trying to find sites that are going to work for you. Now, my ultimate recommendation is if you are really thinking about coming here, you need to do a telephone consult, because the geographic area of Chicagoland is so large and the options so many that we have to kind of guide where you're going to look. You can't just say, tell me all about Cook County or everything there is to know about Chicagoland. It is way hard. Do I know places that you can go? I do, absolutely I can. But it doesn't make much sense to do that in these webinars and podcasts because people freak out. Don't freak out. We can help you. There are good things about this area. I like it. So let us know by giving us a call at drdemographics.com, and our job to help you. Now, Mike, do you have anything you want to add?
I would just say, working with Dr. Demographics is like butter. It really, it's smooth. It makes everything better.
Thank you.
Agree?
Everything better with butter. Really?
Is that why there's butter in the top corner of your slide right there? I'm just curious. Not that
Butter. Yeah.
It's like butter. We're just staying with the Saturday Night Live references. So, no, if you're looking at Chicago is tricky, but we have the answers. Enough said. Email us at info@drdemographics.com or visit us, drdemographics.com. We've got the answers. Don't risk putting yourself in a tough situation.
Now, real quick note, in the future, we're going to be doing Los Angeles, Greater Washington, D.C., which is going to include parts of Virginia and parts of Maryland. And you really need to get this background if you're ever thinking about going to these sites. So please check this space in the future.
Yeah.
Everybody, thank you so much. We look forward to talking to you, and let us know how we can make your life better to find the perfect place to put a practice.